Hello everybody. Welcome back to my channel. My name is Isis and this is, what is going on? My name is Isis and this is Isis Says Hi. I like to make a lot of research videos about topics that I find important to me, and sometimes I do vlogs, though it hasn't been very recent because I haven't been going anywhere because we're in a global pandulce. Anyways, if you like any of those things, please feel free to subscribe. So of course, happy Black History Month. As I said in last week's video, I wanted to do a bit more of a deeper dive into Shirley Chisholm. I didn't realize how much her story resonates to today. I hope you like what I've been able to get. And another weird cleanup thing, if anybody cares, I am trying my best to get through the presidential actions. It's just a lot. So I don't know when exactly that's gonna be out. I hope it'll be out by the end of the month, and then I think I will go up to the 100 days of the presidency, which is usually when you can see how a president will do for the rest of their 4 years. It's kind of like if you ever get a full-time job, you always get a 90-day probation for the employer to see how you're gonna do for the rest of the time that you're there. And then after those 90 days, as long as they don't say you're fired, you can continue working there. So it's kind of like that, but just 10 days extra with the president. That's pretty much what it is, except the president doesn't usually get fired. I mean, they have. One is doing it twice. Let's stop talking about white people. Let's talk about a Black person, specifically a Black woman. Okay, let's go. So Shirley Anita St. Hill Chisholm was the first Black woman in Congress and the first Black woman to seek the nomination for President of the United States from one of the two major political parties. Her motto and title of her autobiography, Unbossed and Unbought, illustrates her outspoken advocacy for women and minorities during her 7 terms in the U.S. House of Representatives. She also wrote another book. It's called The Good Fight. It was written in 1973, and I think her autobiography was in 1970, if I'm not mistaken. Miss Chisholm was born in Brooklyn, New York on November 30th, 1924. She's the oldest of 4 daughters and was born to immigrants. Her father, Charles St. Hill, a factory worker from Guyana, and her mother, Ruby Seal St. Hill, a seamstress from Barbados. She grew up in Barbados with her mother's parents, which are her grandparents, on their farm, receiving a British education while her parents worked during the Great Depression to move the family to Bedford-Stuyvesant, which is usually called Bed-Stuy. I don't know which one is better. I don't know if Bedford-Stuyvesant is the gentrification name that they want you to know, or if it's marginalized people actually making that name. I've always known it as Bed-Stuy. As a little side note, I feel like it's very much an immigrant thing. I have an immigrant family, so I'm not just being an idiot. I feel like it's very much an immigrant parent thing to do, to have their child grow up in a place that's not the US, at least for a couple years in their schooling before moving them over, because usually education is better outside of the US, but what you can afford in the US with education is a bit more better and higher. So I feel like that's always been an immigrant parent thing. They moved here or came back here at around like 10, 11 years old. I don't know why 10, like 9 or 10, like 9 to 11 is when they come back. I've never understood that. Going back. When she came back to Brooklyn, she graduated from Brooklyn Girls High School in 1942. Miss Chisholm then attended Brooklyn College on a scholarship and graduated cum laude with a BA in sociology in 1946, where she won prizes on the debate team. Cum laude is one of those kind of honors that people can get for having like really good grades or a good GPA in school. I think there's summa and magna cum laude. I didn't get either, and when I actually totally could have gotten it, apparently they don't do that in graduate school, which I didn't know. Even though professors encouraged her to consider a political career, she replied that she faced a double handicap as both Black and female, something that's still true today. I wouldn't call it a handicap. Being a Black female and trying to do anything in government still is the worst. Miss Chisholm went on to work as a nursery school teacher, later on serving as director of the Friends Day Nursery in Brooklyn. While doing this, she went to Columbia University for her master's in elementary education and married Conrad Q. Chisholm in 1949. By 1960, she was an education consultant for the New York City's daycare division. Aware of racial and gender inequality, she joined local chapters of the League of Women Voters, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, or the NAACP. It's always so hard to say that whole thing. The Urban League, as well as the Democratic Party Club in Bedford-Stuyvesant, or Bed-Stuy, Brooklyn. The clearest appearance of her West Indies roots was a slight clipped British accent, which I call patois. Patois? I can never say it. You don't really need to stress the syllables. I do all the time. That's what they mean. I don't know why they keep saying clipped British accent or like broken English. No, that's not what it is. It's an actual language. It's just ignored by Europeans. She had that throughout her life, which of course makes sense because she grew up in Barbados for a good chunk of her life. In 1964, Chisholm ran for and became the second Black person in the New York State Legislature representing her Brooklyn neighborhood. After court-ordered redistricting, which is just changing the district, I think I explained that in the video from last week, that usually that happens because racism. And it created a new heavily Democratic district in her neighborhood. And in 1968, Chisholm sought and won a seat in Congress. The influential Democratic political machine headed by Stanley Steingart declared its intention to send a Black candidate from the new district to the House. The endorsement usually resulted in a primary victory. The primary essentially is how people choose a candidate for a party. Usually they have to be within that party. Is my stomach growling? No. Okay. Usually they vote for who should represent the party, and then everybody can generally vote for them. That's usually why you hear primary and then you hear general election. General is when everybody can vote. Primary usually only belongs to people who belong to that party. Democratic political machine, the Democratic, usually you hear them as like the establishment pretty much, and that's people who are well established within the political party. If you're able to get pretty much influential Democrats within a party or influential party candidates, party people, whatever, political party people. It sounds funny like they're going to a rave. Anyways, usually if you're able to get their support, that means you also have a lot of funding and money to be able to campaign, and that means that you probably will win the primary. Nowadays, that usually isn't the case anymore. You would need that unless you can just really do a lot of groundwork and campaigning outside of the establishment to actually win. That can be a lot, which is why you would want the establishment boosting so that you can win. That was fun, right?
You had fun talking politics with me, didn't you?
You're not tired. Not like me. All right, moving on. In the primary, Chisholm faced 3 Black challengers. Civil Court Judge Thomas R. Jones, a former district leader and New York Assemblyman, Dolly Robinson, a former district co-leader, and William C. Thompson, a well-financed state senator. Rich. Chisholm drove around the new district in a sound truck that pulled up outside the housing projects while she announced, "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Fighting Shirley Chisholm walking through." Or coming through? Coming through. I have a way of talking that does something to people. I have a theory about campaigning. You have to let them feel you. Chisholm defeated Thompson, her closest competitor, by about 800 votes. It would make sense that Thompson was her closest competitor because he had more money. In the general election, Chisholm faced Republican, liberal. I never knew I would see that in the same sentence next to each other to describe somebody. His name was James Farmer, and he was one of the main figures in the civil rights movement and was a co-founder of the Congress of Racial Equality and an organizer of the Freedom Riders in the early 1960s. The two candidates had the same positions on housing, employment, and education issues, and both were against the Vietnam War. Farmer accused the Democrat Party of taking Black voters for granted, still do, and their views on gender were the only difference in opinion that they had. Farmer argued women have been in the driver's seat in Black communities for too long, and that the district needed a man's voice in Washington, not that of a little school teacher. Chisholm, whose campaign motto was unbought and unbossed, met that directly, using Farmer's words to highlight discrimination against women and explain her qualifications. There were Negro men in office here before I came in 5 years ago, but they didn't deliver. People came and asked me to do something. I'm here because of the vacuum. Chisholm described Farmer as an outsider. He lived in Manhattan, not in Brooklyn, and used her fluent Spanish to appeal to the growing Hispanic population in the Bed-Stuy neighborhood. More than 80% of the voters were registered Democrats, and Chisholm won the general election by 67% of the vote. In 1968, she became the first Black woman elected to the United States Congress and represented the New York's 12th congressional district for 7 terms from 1969 to 1983. Chisholm was catapulted into the national limelight due to her race, gender, and outspoken personality. She was known as a hardcore liberal. She opposed weapons development, promising to vote against any defense appropriation bill. Appropriations is kind of outlining a specific amount of money that is to go to a certain place. She was against the war in Vietnam, one of only 19 representatives willing to hold hearings on the Vietnam War, because again, what were we doing there? She supported racial and gender equality, advocated on behalf of the plight of the poor, supported the Equal Rights Amendment, supported legalized abortions, favored full employment proposals. She supported increases in federal funding to extend the hours of daycare facilities, a guaranteed minimum annual income for families, defended federal assistance for education, serving as the main backer for a national school lunch bill, and leading her colleagues overriding President Gerald R. Ford's veto. She supported Head Start, which is an early education program that began under President Lyndon B. Johnson, good old LBJ. And during her 7 terms in office, she supported the 1972 Title IX Amendment aimed at ending discrimination against women in federally funded education and sports programs. That's expanded since then to include the LGBTQ+ community, but I could be wrong. She also started some caucuses. So one was the Congressional Black Caucus. She co-founded that, and she also co-founded the National Women's Political Caucus, and she introduced more than 50 pieces of legislation. Some of those were focused on gender equality, racial equality, and ending the Vietnam War. She also served on some committees. She served on the House Agriculture Committee, where she worked to expand the food stamp program. She wasn't a fan of where she was at first, and she actually appealed directly to the House Speaker. And the House Speaker is just kind of like the main person who I guess would kind of delegate how the House sessions go, and that is in the House of Representatives. Usually the majority party takes over the House Speaker, so she wasn't a fan of being on the House Agriculture Committee because that wasn't her top choice. And even though she worked to expand the food stamp program, she at first appealed directly to the House Speaker, John W. McCormick. In doing that, she just kind of sidestepped or ignored going through the regular process of the Ways and Means Committee, specifically the chairman, Wilbur Day Mills, and he was the one who managed the Democratic committee appointments. McCormick told her to be a good soldier, which Miss Chisholm brought her complaint to the House floor. Usually the House floor is where you make speeches. She was reassigned to the Veterans Affairs Committee, which, even though that wasn't her first choice, it was more related to her district in that there were a lot of veterans there, so it made a bit more sense. From 1971 to 77, she served on the Committee on Education and Labor, having won a place on the panel with the help of Representative Hale Boggs, who she had endorsed as a majority leader. Senator, I'm assuming, because majority leader usually is in the Senate. She served on the Committee on Organization, Study, and Review, whose recommended reforms for the selection of committee chairpersons were applied by the Democratic Caucus in 1971. From 1977 to 1981, she served as the Secretary of the Democratic Caucus, and then she later left her position on the Education Committee to accept a seat on the Rules Committee, becoming the first Black woman and the second woman ever to serve on that powerful panel. Chisholm's welcome into the House of Representatives was not warm, and a big part of that was due to her refusal to accept any traditional House expectations for first-term members. Usually you're not supposed to really be eager to join any committee, you're just kind of supposed to observe. Sound familiar? And she didn't do that because that's not what she got voted to do. I have no intention of just sitting quietly and observing. I intend to focus attention on the nation's problems. Her first floor speech spoke to that. And so I talk about 2 of the floor speeches. This was her first one. In her first floor speech, she spoke against the Vietnam War. At times, she criticized Democratic leadership in Congress as much as she did Republicans in the White House. And by 1976, she faced a stiff challenge from within her own party primary, New York City Councilman Samuel D. Wright. He criticized Chisholm for her absence in the House, brought on by the attentions to her presidential campaign, and for what he said was a lack of connection with the district. Chisholm responded by using her national credentials and her role as an improver of Capitol Hill culture. She insisted that her strength was in bringing lawmaking groups together. I can talk with legislators from the South, the West, all over. They view me as a national figure, and that's what makes me more acceptable. 2 weeks later, Chisholm won against Wright and Hispanic political activist Luz Vega in the Democratic primary, winning 54% of the vote to Wright's 36% and Vega's 10%. She won the general election with 83% of the vote. Discrimination followed Chisholm's bid for the 1972 Democratic Party presidential nomination. She was blocked from participating in TV primary debates, and after taking legal action, was allowed to make one speech. Still, students, women, and minorities supported her. She became the first Black candidate to seek a major party's nomination for President of the United States, and the first woman to run for the Democratic Party's presidential nomination. Fighting Shirley Chisholm's defiance against many congressional traditions, along with her reputation as an advocate, limited her influence as a legislator. You have the people on the ground supporting her fully. But that is not the same as the people who are on Capitol Hill, who are usually legislators, usually lawmakers of some sort. And that has always been where the disconnect is. Sometimes it can be bridged, sometimes it's not. Some of them just kind of don't care after they get voted in. Usually it's really easy to keep your seat. In politics, you have to try to bridge making sure that people's needs are met. People who actually are outside of DC, their needs are still being met, while also trying to play this political game to make sure that their needs are met. I am the people's politician, she once told New York Times. If the day should ever come when the people can't save me, I'll know I'm finished. That's when I'll go back to being a professional educator. In her declaration to run for president, she said that none of the other candidates represented the interests of Black and minority voters and the inner city poor. She campaigned across the country and succeeded in getting her name on 12 primary ballots. At the Democratic National Convention, she received 152 delegate votes, or 10% of the total, despite an underfinanced campaign and hostility from the mostly male Congressional Black Caucus. I did a video that goes a little bit more into the delegates. It'll either be featured right now or it'll be at the end of the video. That'll give you a little bit more information on that. And then I also did a video on the Congressional Black Caucus that kind of talks a little bit about it more. A 1974 Gallup poll listed her as one of the top 10 most admired women in America, ahead of Jacqueline Kennedy and Coretta Scott King, and tied with Indian Prime Minister Indira Gandhi for 6th place. While the presidential bid increased her national profile, it stirred controversy with her House colleagues. Many Black male colleagues felt like she had not talked to them about her bid, and that she had betrayed the group's interests by trying to create a coalition of women, Latinx folks, white liberals, and welfare recipients. Side note, I said in the video, they were making alliances with the white men within Congress, so I don't understand how you're mad about that. But anyways, moving on. Gender discrimination, Chisholm said, cut across racial lines. Black male politicians are no different from white male politicians. This woman thing is so deep. I found it out in this campaign if I never knew it before. Her presidential campaign also tensed interactions with other women members of Congress. Outside of McGovern, she was also running against Hubert Humphrey, Edmund Muskie, or Ed Muskie, Henry M. Jackson, and George Wallace, which is nuts. I forgot that George Wallace was a Democrat. He is incredibly racist. I am not the candidate of Black America, although I am Black and proud. I am not the candidate of the women's movement of this country, although I am a woman, and I am equally proud of that. I have never heard something that is so relatable as a Black woman. It's not surprising. Black women are not respected in America. Reading her story reminded me of that. Going to talk about Robert Gottlieb, and he...
She don't see us?
So Robert Gottlieb was an intern within Shirley Chisholm's congressional office, and then later when she decided to run for president, he was the coordinator for the student. And so he's going to talk a little bit about his stories from when he was in her congressional office to when she was doing her presidential campaign. Yeah. Feminists were split over her candidacy. Gloria Steinem, who you would expect to have supported her, supported McGovern instead. That was significant, and it hurt on a personal level quite a bit. You can't look at 1972 through the same magnifying glass as 2016. Having a woman run for president was like having somebody from Mars run for president. And then you have a black woman running for president, and everybody were grappling with how do you deal with such a changed landscape. People were not comfortable with having a black woman, and she often said between being black and a woman, the biggest problem was being a woman. I do and don't disagree with the 1972 and 2016. I can see where he's coming from, but I also think it was just as novel when Hillary Clinton won in 2016. People just couldn't trust that she could do the job, as if she wasn't running against Donald Trump. It was really weird, and when I read up a little bit more about how Hillary was kind of treated in a general sense compared to Trump, and that even goes down to electoral college votes. I think a lot of people at the time were afraid of George Wallace, not fully of Shirley Chisholm, but more of George Wallace winning, because George Wallace was so racist. It's Wallace or Nixon who was the president at the time. And so I think because of that, people just weren't willing to gamble it. I don't think any of these reasons are good, but I do understand how people might have felt at the time. I just don't think it makes sense. Getting back into it, they certainly were a cohesive group within Congress, but I recall hearing about a great deal of tension between certain male members and Mrs. Chisholm. There clearly was within the Black Caucus a significant degree of sexism that she felt. Black male voters did not support Shirley Chisholm. Her candidacy came at a time when black political leaders were unsure about how to exercise power during the upcoming election. Julian Bond, then a representative in Georgia's state House of Representatives and already a prominent national figure, favored having black voters in each state support a favorite son of that state. In each case, the candidate would not be expected to win the nomination, but a collection of delegates for various black candidates from around the country would be the deciding force for the nominating convention. This could allow black voters to make changes to the party platform. So I think what this means, Bernie, even though he knew that Joe Biden pretty much was the winner, decided to still stay in so he could get more delegates. And I talk about it a little bit more in the convention video, but I'm assuming it's so that they can collect more delegates to then broker or kind of push the actual candidate into a deal. I think you need a specific amount of delegates to officially presume the party nomination. If you wanted this person to step down to give you those delegates so that they can move on, you could use the amount of delegates that you have to be able to make sure that the candidate that will win will actually include kind of your demands. But Shirley Chisholm was trying to do that. Carl Stokes, former congressman and the first black mayor of Cleveland, was considering running, but never actually entered the race. Some black leaders thought that he had enough of a national representation to be a serious contender. Others wanted to throw their support behind a white candidate who seemed to have a chance of winning. Because people were trying to figure out who exactly would be the black candidate or the favorite son, Shirley Chisholm decided to just announce a run. An unnamed aide told the New York Times that they were just standing around, peeing on their shoes. So Shirley finally said the hell with it and got a campaign going. If she hadn't, we'd still be without a black candidate. Nobody wants to put their name in the race because I think it just feels pretty overwhelming. But it should let you know that if somebody, especially a black woman, is willing to put her name on the line for this, of course you should probably want to stand behind her. Julian Bond did not appreciate Chisholm's bold move. We may have been peeing on our shoes, but if we were, she wasn't around to get splashed. Of course, because you were peeing on your shoes. The black vote was potentially a powerful force in the 1972 election, but it was split among regional leaders who could not agree on how to bring it together. Georgia State Senator Leroy Johnson had a large organization in Atlanta, but he turned it over to Ed Muskie, who was the front-running white candidate at the time. Louis Stokes, the first black member of Congress from Ohio, threw his support behind Hubert Humphrey. He may have been upset that Chisholm jumped into the race before his brother Carl could make up his mind. Yeah, he definitely was upset about that. Alcee Hastings, a failed U.S. Senate candidate in Florida and prominent black leader, would later be elected to Congress. He endorsed Muskie. Jesse Jackson, John Conyers, and Julian Bond all traveled to Ohio to help get voters for George McGovern. The black vote as an organized group didn't exist. I don't really think it still does. Black leadership had been broken up since the death of Martin Luther King Jr., who was killed only 4 years earlier. Black political leaders had more to gain by becoming the token black endorser of a major white candidate than by uniting around Shirley Chisholm. The most intense point of the primary came when George Wallace was shot 5 times in an unsuccessful assassination attempt, which I did not know, and was left paralyzed from the waist down for the rest of his life. Surprising everybody and angering her own supporters, Chisholm visited him at the hospital. Robert Gottlieb says that she did not agree with anything that Wallace stood for, but she understood that if you really care about the country and you want to affect change, you have to embrace everybody. She was a true human being of sensitivity, and when she saw that he was shot, he was a human being in pain, and she wasn't going to turn her back on him. Leading me to believe that I don't think any congressperson, even the presidential candidates, actually visited him. And I mean, this is an argument that still goes on today. What lengths should you try to have unity with people who do not agree with you? A lot of people, including myself, have always said that I do not mind unity as long as that person respects that I am a human being and that I should have just as much rights as they do. If we agree in that respect, I don't mind unifying with folks. The issue is that a majority of the folks don't believe I should have rights as a human being. Asking people who have been marginalized and oppressed for so long to unify with somebody who believes that they should still be oppressed, I feel like that's where the issue comes in. Going back into this story, Chisholm had thought that she would win Florida. It had a lot of delegates at the time and she thought she had a chance. But then George Wallace went to Florida and said to vote for her, and that didn't go over well because he's racist, and she only got 4% of the vote. Big part of that was because a lot of people thought that she sided with him. Wallace ended his campaign after being shot, meaning less competitors. So the people who were a little bit afraid of voting for her and supporting her because probably of Wallace could have totally said, okay, well, I support Chisholm, right? Just saying. One woman told the Tucson Daily Citizen, I would like to be able to afford a vote for Shirley Chisholm, but I can't. I want someone who will beat Nixon. And again, this is the primary, right? This isn't even the general election. This is just the primary. The same article in the Tucson Daily described a 50-something-year-old woman wearing a Chisholm for President button, but had still not decided who they should vote for. She did not think that she was ever going to be elected president, Gottlieb says. She felt strongly about her issues, and she hoped to get enough delegates to go to the convention as a power broker. Chisholm arrived at the convention with 152 delegates, more than Ed Muskie and more than Hubert Humphrey. Her plan had been to hope for a tied convention in which she could use her delegates to negotiate a black running mate, a woman to serve in the cabinet, and a Native American as a Secretary of Interior, which is incredibly important because usually the Department of Interior deals with Native Americans, and so that would have been really impactful. But of course, McGovern had gotten 1,729 delegates and had no motivation to make any deals at the convention. Chisholm went back to Congress, where she continued to serve until 1981, and of course, McGovern did not win. And then later, Geraldine Ferraro, who is a white woman, came after her while running for president in the presidential primary for the Democratic Party and was later nominated for vice president. She had less experience in elected office than Chisholm. White privilege really can supersede all. So you got sexism and you got racism, right? And people are always way more down for a white woman and allowing them to maybe make that path than black women. So it's always kind of a shocker when black women particularly get to have that first completely. After her presidential campaign, Brooklyn Democrats had assumed that Chisholm was losing interest in her House seat. In 1982, Chisholm decided to step down after her term. Shirley Chisholm would like to have a little life of her own, she told the Christian Science Monitor, mentioning personal reasons for her decision to leave the House. She wanted to spend more time with her second husband, Arthur Hardwick Jr., a New York State legislator she had married about 6 months after divorcing Conrad Chisholm in 1977. I feel like black women do devote a lot of their time sometimes to the greater good and not always themselves. I really like that she said that because she's correct. Other reasons factored into Chisholm's decision to leave the House. She was disappointed over the conservative turn the country had taken with the election of President Ronald Reagan in 1980. There were also tensions with people on her political party side, particularly with black politicians who she claimed misunderstood her efforts to build alliances. While her speech about racial inequality could be passionate times, her actions toward the white establishment in Congress were often seen as peacemaking to her colleagues. Chisholm claimed that many members of the Black community did not understand the need for negotiation with white politicians. We still have to engage and compromise, the highest of all arts. Blacks can't do things on their own, nor can whites. When you have Black racists and white racists, it is very difficult to build bridges between communities. I think back then it wasn't very well defined about what racist means, but now we know that as racism being power, not just being discriminatory towards somebody else. It's always that discussion between how much do you wait for change and how much do you push for change, and there's never a clear answer, even though people feel like there is. Politics deals more with power than with the people. But when you have politics, this power structure, right, that pretty much takes over how our government works and how things get passed, when people are still trying to hold on to that kind of power, you're not always going to get change as quickly as you want it. And so she's not wrong in that you do have to kind of appease establishment sometimes, even if you don't want to, even if it's not completely helpful. Because if you want to move the needle towards change, you're gonna have to sometimes make do. And until the way power is seen in politics is changed, and that includes making politicians become more accountable to the people who voted them in, until you make it so that politicians have to be held to a standard directly by the people, not anybody else, this is kind of what's gonna exist. And it's understanding that you have to kind of figure out where you can really push the needle versus where you're just gonna have to wait for that change. It is unfair that you have to wait for that change, because you shouldn't have to wait. Right now, we're discussing a $15 minimum wage. That is something that should have happened a long time ago. And doing it now, as great as it is to hear, does nothing now compared to when it should have happened. The federal minimum wage should have gone up along with the cost of living. So when you think about stuff like that, the needle and the pushing for change takes so long. And she came in there, right, like as an advocate and somebody who really wanted to push for change and for the people to really get what they need. And that ended up not really happening the way that she wanted it to. And that is because politics really makes sure that that just can't happen. And that is not her fault. These are personal opinions. Until you move that power to the people, it's not gonna be as easy as people want it to be. And I think that's something that's really difficult for people to understand. Does that make sense? Hopefully that made sense. After leaving Congress, Chisholm co-founded the National Political Congress of Black Women and campaigned for Jesse Jackson's presidential bids in 1984 and 1988. She also taught at Mount Holyoke College. Though nominated to be U.S. Ambassador to Jamaica by President William J. Bill Clinton, Chisholm declined due to her health. Also, did he not know that she was Barbados and Guyana? I don't understand why he did that. Anyways, in 1991, she settled in Palm Coast, Florida, where she wrote and lectured, and died on January 1st, 2005 in Ormond Beach, Florida. In an interview towards the end of her life, she downplayed her run for the White House. "I want history to remember me, not as the first Black woman to have made the bid for the presidency of the United States, but as a Black woman who lived in the 20th century and who dared to be herself. I want to be remembered as a catalyst for change in America." Chisholm was awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom in 2015, 10 years after her death. Reading her story, I didn't realize how relevant to today it was. I feel like I said it throughout. It just reminded me that change is not as easy as people want it to be, and it is not because the people, usually I should say, it is not because the people who we see visibly in office don't want that change. It's because of the way politics and power works that make that change next to impossible. And the thing is to not give up, because when you do give up, that's when change usually stops. To keep fighting and keep pushing, to be aware of how your power as a person can really impact government. And I hope Shirley Chisholm's life and story helped to give you that, because even though she might not have won the war, she made a heavy impact in what she was able to do. You as a person can do a lot of good. Y'all have power in some way. I'm done. I'll see you next week for another video. Hopefully I will get that other one done soon, and yeah, bye.